Welcome to today's edition of The World Today on defending Indigenous rights and land and decolonizing the future. Taking place during Penn's Climate Week, this important discussion gives us an opportunity to reflect on Indigenous Peoples Day, which was celebrated here in the United States just yesterday. Indigenous peoples across the Americas have faced more than 500 years of colonial occupation and exploitation. The struggles for Indigenous rights, especially land rights, continues with critical and global implications for human rights, including women's human rights, justice, and climate change. Today, we'll hear, for instance, about how secure Indigenous land tenure can improve environmental outcomes and underwrite the well-being and prosperity of Indigenous communities. From the perspectives of three Maya activists from Belize, we'll learn about challenges as well as opportunities facing Indigenous peoples and their communities. To guide us through this discussion, I'd like to welcome our four distinguished panelists to the Perry Worldhouse stage: Krista Koch, Pablo Mies, Filiberto Penados, and Richard Leventhal. Christina Koch is a Quechua Maya community leader. She founded and is presently program director of the Julian Cho Society, which is dedicated to the conservation of the environments and rights of the Indigenous peoples of Southern Belize. She is also one of the key organizers and co-spokesperson for the Maya Leaders Alliance. Pablo Mies is the program director of the Maya Leaders Alliance and Toledo Alcalde Association. These organizations, headed by the traditional leaders of 39 Maya villages in Southern Belize, led strategic litigation against the government of Belize for Maya land rights. In 2020, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres appointed Mies to the Advisory Board of Trustees of the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous People. Filiberto Penados is an associate professor and research director at Galen University and chair of the Julian Cho Society. He is a co-founder of the Center for Engaged Learning Abroad, Belize, and a Maya scholar whose work focuses on Indigenous education and development. Richard M. Leventhal, our moderator, is executive director of the Penn Cultural Heritage Center of the Penn Museum, as well as professor in the Department of Anthropology here at Penn. He serves as curator in the American section at the University of Penn's Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, where he formerly served as the Williams director. He's written extensively on the ancient Maya and about cultural heritage preservation. And with that, we welcome our guests to the stage. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I want to welcome you all here, and I'm very pleased that you could be here this afternoon for this program. Before I begin, I would like to just say, thank you. Just wanted to voice a land acknowledgement. This was the land that the University of Pennsylvania sits on, was Lenni Lenape land, and I have great hope that sometime in the near future, the university will deal with some of these issues related to the Lenni Lenape and dealing with the inequities that have happened in the past and continue today. I also want to thank a number of people just very quickly: Charlotte Williams, who's sitting up here in front, Brian Daniels, who've all helped with this event, but also in bringing my friends and our friends here to the university. And I want to thank the people of the Department of Anthropology as well as Perry Worldhouse. When we started to talk about these colleagues coming up here to the University of Pennsylvania, we had an initial conversation by email. And I just want to read this to you very quickly, because we sent a message to them saying, how do you want to be called? And I got a response from Filiberto initially that said, I am not sure what to call our band or our species, or if we need a name. Are we Maya activists, Maya scholars, Maya activist scholars, Maya activists and scholars, or advisors to the TAA? I think, in fact, my colleagues here are all of the above. And I really want to welcome them. To my right is Pablo Mies, who is Program Director of the Julian Cho Society and the Toledo Alcaldes Association, and a board member for the United Nations Voluntary Fund for Indigenous People. Christina Koch is spokesperson for the Maya Leaders Alliance and Toledo Alcaldes Association and Executive Director of the Julian Cho Society. And Filiberto Panados is Associate Professor and Research Director at Galen University and Chair of the Julian Cho Society. I also just want to mention that we here at Penn are working closely with the Toledo Alcaldes Association as well as the Maya Leaders Alliance on issues related to representation and identity. One of the things we're now focusing on is the development of a community museum, possibly in the village of Laguna, which will focus not so much on telling tourists necessarily who the Maya people are, but rather a museum that will focus on self-representation and thinking about how to maintain culture and tradition within the village with the children who exist today, as well as the ones who come along in the near future. So with that very short statement, I'd like to start and ask perhaps each of you to introduce yourself more about some of the issues that you're focused upon, and particularly related to land rights, indigenous rights, both in Belize and internationally. And then I have a few questions that we'll begin to ask. Filiberto, why don't you begin?
Thank you, Richard. First of all, I think I've been introduced, but okay, let me say that one of the things I'm particularly interested in is the question of indigenous future making. And I think indigenous peoples are often kind of cast as people kind of the past, and people who might not be able to make it in the present, but really indigenous peoples are future makers. And I think the question of the future and what the future might be is certainly very relevant, especially if we think about climate change. That certainly is one of the things that I'm particularly interested in, and I've been working with my brother and sister here in Toledo to try to understand, you know, how do Maya people imagine their future? How do they craft it?
Well, good afternoon to all of you. It's certainly an honor and a pleasure to be here on the land of the Lenape people. Thank you for welcoming us. And certainly from the Maya people of Southern Belize, I bring you greetings. Of particular interest to me is really to discuss how land rights fits within indigenous people's struggles. A lot of times when we hear about land rights or we hear about the rights discourse, we think about property rights, or we think about ownership of land, or we think about mapping territories and drawing boundaries. When in fact for us, the Rarchi and the Mopan Maya people, it is a lot more than that. It really is about security and protection of a land tenure system that has provided for our survival. So it really is a response as a people to our survival on the lands that we live, on the lands that we make our lives on. It's also, you know, the security of our relationships to each other as a community. And perhaps one of the things that I want to emphasize today is just to really underscore that land rights for us is really land tenure security. And it really is a response to our survival as a collective people on a collective land. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sage Oleh. Greetings. So in the work that we do, you sort of have to be, to know a little bit of everything, because that's what it takes to keep the movement going and to keep communities going. But perhaps the areas of interest for me really is in our ability as indigenous peoples to continue be organized peoples. We've always had our own system of organization. So indigenous governance is really an area for me because it's about process, it's about decision-making, it's about deliberately being a part of making decisions that will shape the future of not only the community, but everybody else that we interact with.
Great, thank you very much. Let me ask the first question. I just spoke a few words about a land acknowledgement of people who are no longer on this land. Yesterday was Indigenous Peoples Day. Do you think that either of these events, saying a land acknowledgement or the Indigenous Peoples Day, does it really begin to change the way people view Indigenous people? Does it begin to help in your struggle and your fight for rights and land tenure? I'll let anyone, any of you.
I think it certainly helps. I think it's very important to acknowledge the land upon which you are and the people who were the first peoples on that land. A lot of times we are a people that are being erased, and in every way we can recover that, we should. And I think that you recognizing Indigenous Peoples Day, I mean, for us as Indigenous people, every day is Indigenous Peoples Day, right? I mean, there's not one day that we exist, although it's important to look at that day and reflect upon what this means for the people of that land. Unfortunately, many times what it ends up doing is affording an opportunity for nation states or outsiders to sort of feel good about themselves. We're doing something, right? And a lot of it is really, I like to talk about the government of Belize being sort of a photo op kind of government, where it's important to take the pictures and to smile and to create the illusion that everything is okay on Indigenous Peoples Day. But really, when you think about it, the real issues are still persistent, right? And so I think that it's important to take every opportunity to acknowledge Indigenous people's presence, to acknowledge their existence, because a lot of times, especially for us as Maya people, you know, a lot of things that are written about us is that the civilization collapsed, they no longer exist. There's many narratives like that, and very little about the living Maya. And so anytime you can acknowledge that for all Indigenous peoples, I think it's important.
And let me ask, perhaps either Filiberto or Pablo, how do you begin to get real action? How do you begin to get real change to begin to occur? Obviously, not just with the land acknowledgement, obviously not just with the Indigenous Peoples Day, but how do you get that type of change, whether it's Belize or internationally?
Well, that's just a very big question, isn't it? Well, I mean, I think the question of land rights is certainly an advance, that there's no doubt that we're talking now about collective land rights, and I think it's important. But I think for me, one of the greatest things that needs to happen, and if celebrations like this can help to move that, is to kind of recognize that and accept the difference that exists in the world, right? I think it's one of the fundamental things. Earlier, I was sharing in conversation that I think Indigenous peoples, you know, whether it is their lands, whether it's their heritage, whether it is their labor, these are sites of contestation, right? But for what they should be used, who should control these, and what are the meaning of these things. And so what we're talking about here, land rights, is obviously one of those things. And I think we have to be able to recognize that there are hierarchies in terms of these ways of knowing and so on that need to be challenged. And they need to be challenged, obviously, in our own person, but I think in terms of the state, and to be able to think of this other world in which, you know, all of this plurality can exist. So for me, of course, personally, the university, policy, nation state, this really needs to shift, I think.
So perhaps we could also turn to the question that Christina raised about land tenure. And what does that mean? And how is that that whole question of land tenure moving forward in Belize today? Pablo.
As my colleagues have mentioned, I think that clearly Indigenous peoples, in the case of Belize, the Maya people, we are a land-based people. Our very existence, our dignity, the way we understand each other, the way we are able to recreate our existence, the way we're able to innovate is based on our ability to sustain a relationship, to be free on the land. And so in that context, and when you think of land tenure is more than just parceling a piece of land or issuing a paper for a piece of land. It is really about the ability of people to continue to exist and sustain their existence on the land. So this then, I think, is crucial in order for indigenous peoples globally, their ability to have security of tenure. It's important for them to be able to have that if we are going to have a chance at being a part of the process of creating our future and perhaps even going beyond that, addressing some of the global problems of inequality, of poverty, marginalization, and perhaps the one that stares at us every time, climate change.
We have a question from one of the audience, but specifically thinking about what are some of the progress that has been made in Belize. I know that you've been fighting for land rights for 20, 30 years. There's been made some progress, and at the same time, I think there's been some pushback from the nation state recently. Christina, could you just talk a little bit about what steps have been taken in terms of both formal political steps, but also formal legal steps?
Certainly, we have come a long way. I mean, it's been a long-standing struggle of the Maya people to secure tenure to their lands. One of the things we did, some of you might have read in 2015, after about 30 years of legal struggle, using a legal strategy to seek recognition and respect of our land tenure rights. The highest appellate court of Belize, the Caribbean Court of Justice, recognized and affirmed Maya people's rights to their lands and resources, and basically made 3 declarations to the government of Belize. The first is to clearly define, delimit the territories of indigenous peoples in southern Belize. And the second is really to develop a mechanism through which these rights would be protected, whether that be through a law or whether that be through policies that protect our rights. And then finally, the Caribbean Court of Justice imposed what you would call an interim injunction, which is basically to cease and desist from granting any further development or concessions or permits that might adversely affect the use and enjoyment of those lands by the people who are now recognized owners. And so that was a huge step for us. Unfortunately, it's hard for me to report, but it's important to say that the implementation is really the hardest part of the struggle. We have been able to win legal affirmations, but the implementation of those affirmations is yet to be won. And so we continue to map our territory to define, even though the government is dragging its feet on that. We continue to think about what the rights would look like in the form of a law. And we, of course, continue to advocate for the full and effective implementation of what the court has now affirmed.
Great, thank you. Let me actually turn to another event of just before the pandemic. This was called an Abink, and this was a gathering in Punta Gorda. And this was a request from the MLA and the TAA specifically to come down, people who had worked in this region. And all the people who'd worked in Toledo, whether they're archaeologists or anthropologists or sociologists, went to many meetings around the world to present the information. Very seldom did they come to Toledo, to the District of Toledo, and report to the Maya people. And so just before the pandemic, there was a request to me and several other scholars to come down and report to the Maya leaders on what the work that we had done over the past several years. And I'd like Filiberto to just talk a little bit about that gathering, why it was important, why you decided to do it, and perhaps what the next steps might be, because there's a real change in the relationship between researchers and people on the ground.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. Well, first of all, I think it might be important to understand what a bink means. A bink is a catchy word, so from the language of Christina and Pablo, which means usually when somebody's going to a meeting, they'll say "Shikwechi a bink." I'm going to the bink meeting, but a bink actually means to listen. Okay, so I love the word because it just changes the way that you think about a meeting. Normally, when you go to a meeting, it's like I want to say something, right? And this is saying no, you're going to listen. And that's part of, I think, of the kind of thing that is happening among indigenous peoples, not only in Belize, but around the world, where they're reaching into their own heritage and, grasping at that wealth of knowledge to think about the world differently. If you think about Abink, as I said, it's an entirely different concept about a meeting. But anyway, so this academic Abink, so to speak, was planned because, as I think Pablo mentioned, right, there's been this land rights case. And often when you think about indigenous people, the question of, they're fighting for land rights, but it's not just land rights. Christina said it's land tenure. It's kind of the way that they relate to the land, and implicating in that is also the way that they relate with each other, okay? Post 2015, I can imagine a court case, it consumes a lot of energy and resources, but post 2015, the communities have begun to focus more on thinking, so what will be our future relationship with the land and with each other? And in the construction of this future, that, okay, you have all of these researchers that come around and do lots of interviews and dig around, and we never hear from them. But what sort of insights have they generated that might help us to think about the challenges that we face? What are some of the insights that they might have generated to help us understand the context and to think about the future? Okay, so I was one, and as Richard said, often researchers go and publish papers and report elsewhere. That's kind of what academics do. So this kind of changed things around, because indigenous people are saying, hey, come and tell us what you have found out. And it can be, I think, you can imagine it can be intimidating. You can become very nervous as an academic. Well, I wasn't reporting, but I imagine for my colleagues that it would have been. But it changes the dynamics, right? Having to speak to those people who you have been researching on. So yeah, the intent was that. There's the relationship between indigenous peoples and researchers is often problematic. So this begins to change this already. It could help, and I think it has helped in some ways. Some people have, after this conversation, some academic researchers have picked up on certain questions that say, hey, this would be something good to research because it's not only academically interesting, intellectually interesting, but really important to the communities. So that, I think, is of incredible value. We hope to do it again, right? And do it better, perhaps in a more focused way, and to try to connect indigenous peoples more closely and to influence what researchers are doing.
Thank you very much. I think it's very important, because I really do begin to think that it may foster the nature of changing the relationship between outsiders and researchers and indigenous people. They need to be all mixed up, and they need to be the processes need to be changed so that there is a real relationship between all the people that we're talking about, whether they're researchers, indigenous people or not. And I think it was an incredibly interesting and important start. So I congratulate you. Actually, let me turn to Pablo just for a second. This is Environmental Week here at Penn. This is a question of climate change that is a very big one that people are thinking about. And as they think about climate change, they constantly are saying, we need to begin to think about, perhaps even work with, which would be a shock for people, indigenous people. That this is important because indigenous people's relationship with the land is better than the Western society. Begin to think about the land not in terms of just resources that it can give, but in fact, based upon things about how one saves and preserves the land for the future. I mean, these have been some of the issues, whether it's been the Dakota pipeline, variety of issues here in the United States. I mean, you work internationally. Do you think that this is actually a conversation that's real, or is this more just a conversation, again, that makes people say, oh, we have to talk to indigenous people for the first time?
Very important question, and I think it's quite relevant. I mean, towards the end of this month, the COP27 in Egypt, we'll see hundreds of indigenous peoples and thousands of leaders from all over the world convening on this issue of climate change. But perhaps there are three main issues to kind of grapple with. The first is, for instance, the effective participation of indigenous peoples in the decision-making process that's shaping the positions and the responses of nation states as it relates to climate change. Are we satisfied with it? Perhaps not. There's a lot to desire there. The second is that in the entire response to climate change, This is not just an exercise for Indigenous people. We're talking about this earlier today. Belize, for instance, saw a hurricane coming around it. There's massive flooding. Areas that have never flooded before, just going over the homes in terms of water level. And so the issue of resource and benefit access and distribution, again, is something that is structural. There's a lot of climate financing, but how much of that is actually shifting the core issues in communities? And perhaps the third issue is perhaps the most touchy part, perhaps the most the underlining challenge, and that is recognition and respect for Indigenous people's rights. Because here we're talking not only about just celebrating the day, but we're talking about shifting power dynamics. We're talking about the issue of whose knowledge is most valuable or more valuable. In fact, one of the issue that will be negotiated has to do with simple language, scientific knowledge versus knowledge in general. Just that in itself, we'll see endless hours of negotiation. Position of Indigenous people is that it should be just knowledge, because then it leaves it open for Indigenous people's knowledge to be a part of it. When you begin to say scientific knowledge in the text of agreements, then it restricts that. And so I mention all of this then in the context of the inclusion of Indigenous peoples in the climate response. Clearly, as you indicate, science and research have shown that areas that have land tenure security, those areas have seen better management, better protection of forests. And this is not being made up. This is the reality of where things are. So one would think that recognizing, respecting Indigenous people's rights would be something that all those involved would be kind of running towards. But it begins to touch on the issue of power dynamics. It begins to touch on the issue of structural inequalities that exist. It begins to touch on the issue of spaces where everybody who must be there are perhaps not there in terms of decision making. So it becomes then a very complex process. Now, is there value for Indigenous people's participation in this? Yes. We spoke earlier today, recognizing that Indigenous peoples exist in very contentious, contested spaces. In fact, we always say we're in a constant state of negotiations. And again, I think it speaks to, for instance, the Abink. The Abink that we undertook is in response to recognizing that Indigenous peoples are not also static societies. There is the need for knowledge from all corners to be able to become a part of how we envision a future and how we make the future. So I think that there is value. Are we doing enough? Perhaps not, but I think there are small steps being taken in the right direction.
Great, thank you. Christine, if I could, just shifting over about cultural heritage and spaces of contestation for just a moment. One of the issues that I know the government of Belize gets very nervous about is the resources that come from tourism and tourists going to ancient archaeological sites. And there are 3 or 4 medium to large sites in the Toledo district. And there's a concern about what happens to these sites as land tenure issues move towards Maya peoples controlling much of this land. So I think my question is, what happens to cultural heritage? How do you foresee the future of some of these archaeological sites? These are important sites not only to save, but also to think about in terms of tourism dollars that come in.
Certainly a very important question. And again, it goes back to the question of who prescribes meaning and significance to these places, and from whose narrative are we writing this, right? I think it's important to underscore that in Belize, for instance, the Institute of Archaeology plays a big role in determining access management of these sites. The Antiquities Act places ownership of all antiquities in the hands of the state, and not the hands of the people. And while on the one hand, Belize says, well, all of the Maya temple sites are the heritage of Belizean people, but that's yet another attempt to erase the connections that Maya people themselves have to these sites. We also have our own significance, our own meanings to these sacred places. For instance, we have shifted from trying to shift the narrative from Maya ruins to Maya temples, because they're not ruins, they're not places of ruins. They are temples and they are sacred. We also have our own aspirations as to how we see the future management of these sites. And here again lies the contestation, because as you know, power and control is important to the state, being able to control how the revenues are generated, how they are being used. And even now, I mean, as Indigenous people, if you want to access those sites to practice your spirituality, your spiritual ceremonies, you still have to ask for permission. You still have to pay a fee. And these are things that, of course, when you begin to disempower the state from controlling these spaces, then it becomes a contested space, and it becomes a situation where Indigenous people themselves then will have to redefine their relationship, and government will have to redefine its relationship. We're hoping that through the legislation that will be drafted, that some of these issues will be addressed, and that we can come to some kind of consensus around how Indigenous peoples themselves can define the new relationships with these places.
Which I think is very important, and also about the narrative about who built these and the connection of those people to Maya people today, which is a very important conversation, both in Belize, in Mexico, and other parts of the region. And that narrative tends again to be controlled by either the nation state or archaeologists, researchers who sometimes ignore the continuity to people today. And I think that's become a very contentious point in Mexico, and I know it's one also in Belize. Let me just, for the audience, if you have some questions and you'd like to ask, there is a microphone in the back, and in about 3 or 4 minutes, we're going to open it up for questions. So if you'd like to begin to line up, now is the time to begin to do that, or so that we can move sort of seamlessly to that part of the program. There is a question that I'd like to direct to Filiberto, and it is, how often does research into Indigenous practices lead to outsiders, and this is the word, quote, stealing knowledge versus expanding awareness?
Well, how often? I think it happens too often, of course. You know, yeah, I think that the short answer to it is it happens too often. I think there's a lot of interest in Indigenous knowledge, but more in terms of like elements of Indigenous knowledge. Like you pick, bits of knowledge, and then you sort of you write an article, or it's exploited in some one way or another. There's less of an interest, I think, in Indigenous ways of knowing, right? And understanding that Indigenous peoples have a whole knowledge system. Okay. It has to do with how knowledge is transmitted, what constitutes knowledge, who has access to knowledge, the whole system of knowledge. And there's very little interest, I think, in that perhaps if there was a broader understanding, or a deeper respect for Indigenous knowledge, there would be less of this happening. Okay. To give you an example, and I guess it happens also at the university. If you want to be a medical doctor, you have to go through a whole process. You apply and all of that, and you're accepted or not. Okay. And we kind of accept that. We accept that you cannot just walk into a medical school and start studying. Okay, you have to go through a process. But it's not the same kind of way that we deal with Indigenous knowledge. There's an assumption that you can just walk and have access to whatever knowledge that you want. And sometimes when Indigenous people say, well, no, you can't really do that. It's something that people are troubled by. But in Indigenous ways of knowing, if you want to know something, you have to also kind of demonstrate that you have the capacity, the disposition, and the right attitude to access knowledge, and they're going to use it for a good purpose. Okay, maybe just one final thing on that. If you're a medicinal healer, a traditional healer, okay, and in a community, and if you were to put a sign that says, traditional healer here, you pay $25, come, nobody will go there, right? Nobody will go because it's almost like that person doesn't have respect for the knowledge and is misusing that knowledge. That also creates doubts in the minds of people. So perhaps if there was more, understanding of the indigenous ways of knowing, and there's greater interest in that, then, it might create more awareness and might lead to interepistemic dialogue between different ways of knowing, I guess.
And I just very quickly, I think the Abink is one of those ways that you begin to change the nature of relationships. And then I also would say that hopefully the museum that we're talking about may also lead to that type of understanding and set of relationships about indigenous ways of knowing. There are multiple ways of knowing, not just what is perceived to be the scientific approach as seen within universities and academic centers.
Yeah, maybe just one thing. I'm thinking that disembeddedness was the word that I was looking for. Like, you disembed indigenous knowledge from the context from which it's generated. And I think it would be great to adopt and to think about indigenous knowledge, how it is embedded, and to understand that whole system. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. Let me turn to, if you'd like to ask your first questions, I believe the microphone is on.
I think it is on too. Awesome. Well, thank you for a wonderful panel. My question will be directed towards Christina, but you're all welcome to answer. And it's kind of on, so combining this ways of knowing, because we're dealing with the legacy of capitalism, colonialism as bedfellows, but specifically when we're now looking at undoing the projects of mestizo nationhood. And so the kinds of relationships with land that are going to need to come about with not only people who have been indigenous and remained in indigeneity despite colonial violence, but then in these projects in Mexico and also in other parts of Latin America, where you see so much of this as a product of mestizaje, as an ideology of removing people from indigeneity. And so I wonder for all of you, in the process of the campesino becoming the campesino, of people becoming dispossessed and or violently removed from indigeneity, what things people then who are reconnecting and or trying to sincerely come into these projects of indigenous knowing ought to do, because I think, this is a huge part of why Latin America, you see this kind of dispossession and the idea that being indigenous is inherently bad or inherently put into the past. Thank you. Sorry.
I think that's really an important observation. I think that it's important for all peoples of indigenous origins to return to the connection to the land. Not just in terms of perhaps residing on the land, but in terms of practice, in terms of accessing the traditional knowledge, in terms of finding ways to find knowledge keepers that will transmit that knowledge, but practicing it is really important because we learn by doing. Indigenous people learn by doing. We learn by being on the land and using the land and interacting with the land, but also interacting with each other. And so I think that a return in that way, redeveloping a connection. We call ourselves Ralchoch. Ralchoch in my language means children of the earth. And really, it encompasses an identity that could not be separate from us being physically connected to the land. Everything we eat comes from the land, right? And someday we don't see ourselves as separate from the land. Someday we will all return to the land, become again a part of that land. And so I think it's important for to rescue your own identity, reconnect to a place, reconnect to a community, and reconnect to your practices and your values in order for you to then recreate and remember. Because I think that the memory of our people, the memory of our ancestors remain with us, but we need to recall those through practice.
Maybe can I just add something there? I think it goes to this idea that I started earlier by saying that often we think of indigenous peoples of the past and struggling in the present, and who knows whether they'll make it into the future kind of thing. But I think, and often this is part of the reason that happens is because we tend to counterpose like traditional versus kind of modern as distinct two things that are opposing, right? When, indigenous people are peoples of the present and who they are now, is not the same that they were 500 years ago and will be 500 years, from now. And so sometimes can this be a disservice, I think, for Indigenous people, because it means, they cannot take on new knowledge. And that's not what happens. I think Indigenous peoples around the world, they take up these technologies and make them theirs. A good example of that, I think, in Maya communities is the machete, right? I mean, I joke with my friends and say, if you go to southern Belize, you think that every Maya man is born with a machete in his hand because they are so great at using it. And the machete was not invented by the Maya people, but yet it has so much significance, right, to Maya people, both in terms of producing food, so sustaining life, and also in defending themselves, because it has been used as a weapon as well. So in their hands, it's resignified. So I was thinking about mestizaje. In a way, it would be a good thing, except that mestizaje sometimes is coached between this traditional modern and tradition is being less. So it forces people to kind of reject or become kind of culturally conservative, as societies that are kind of under siege.
Let me ask you just a quick question, sort of a follow-up on that. I mean, the nation state sees land as defining who they are, who the power structure. You're talking about a change in the nature of land tenure. How do you get the nation state to stop thinking about ownership and stop thinking about the nature of, we own these resources, we own this land, this is the nation states. This is a major change that has to happen in the United States, has to happen in Belize, has to happen in Mexico, but I don't know how you do it. I don't know how you get there. Pablo, could you? I know it's a difficult construct.
Well, I think it goes back to the question that was asked earlier, that ultimately, I think if we really sit down and try to understand the struggles of Indigenous people, it is essentially what it offers is a position to root one's thinking and how one understands themselves in the world we exist now, and how we imagine our children, our children's children existing in this world. So it offers us a point of reference to root ourselves, I think. But ultimately, what it really calls on is for the individual to begin reshaping the way we see things, the way we think about things, the way we relate to things, including the mic, the phone, the way we travel, that level of consciousness. And if you think in terms of the nation state, I mean, it really is calling on a more responsible society that can hold its government more accountable, more transparent. So if you put it in the context of climate change, for instance, in this context, I think one of the points that's being pushed forward by Indigenous leaders is for state to see themselves much more as the duty bearer with transparency and accountability, and for Indigenous peoples and local communities to see themselves more as beyond being beneficiaries of projects, but partners in shaping the responses, the way we innovate our mitigation to climate change, for instance. So I think it really comes down to whether you're Indigenous or not. What our story really is, what we're saying, this is how we see ourselves. We've had the opportunity to relate to the land this way. We've seen so much good. I come from a small community where everybody right now who's 18 years and above, young men and women, have a piece of land to build their home, given to them by the community. Where else can you find that? It doesn't matter whether you have a degree or not, whether you have a job or not, whether you have money or not. It is talking about something that everybody should have a chance to access and to enjoy and to use. So, but this requires then a shift in the way how we relate to each other, how we relate to the resources around us. So that's just like at the micro level. So we believe that there is a potential to create a greater consciousness, a greater awareness, and to become more responsible citizens, I think, ultimately is the aim.
Maybe I can add something to that as well. In my experience, nation states governments respond to two things. They respond to votes and they respond to money. right? And in Maya communities, for example, until recently, before we had the affirmed land rights in the Caribbean Court of Justice, the government used to offer land in exchange for votes, right? And it built the system of clientelism where, you know, there's a dependency. And so I want to vote for this party because I'm being promised a piece of land, right? And so that was the practice, and the government responds to that, right? Government is looking for votes. The government is also threatened when the resources that they would ordinarily depend on to build their capital, to build wealth and economy for them, when that is threatened, then they themselves feel threatened. And so two things. I think, though, that there is an opportunity. I don't think that, as we mentioned earlier in one of the classes, I don't think that the way to view it is really to say that the government is the enemy. It's really to look at where are the opportunities for collaboration. And I think one of the things that we've been trying to shift away from is not to go to the government with our hands out and say, what can you give us, right? Or what is it that the Maya people want, right? Really, it's to be able to say, look, we want to be able to collaborate with you to develop our lands in a way that has meaning and significance to us. We want to be able to do it on a timeline that works with us. But we also want to make sure that it's rather than you coming to tell us how we're going to do this, rather to think about it as a joint venture, to think about it as Indigenous peoples have knowledge. They are able to innovate. They're able to think. They have existing economies that they want to expand on. How do we work with them then to do the very thing, to innovate, to create these economies that would work? And how do we do that in a respectful way, recognizing them as people with agency, people with an ability to define their own paths, right? And to do that together. And so one of the things that I've consciously been trying to shift is to tell the government of Belize and the rest of Belize and the world that Indigenous people are not trying to stand in the way of development. We are in fact trying to stand in the way of exploitation, not development. And so two things: if we can collaborate with government to develop in a way that is meaningful to us, if we can have recognition for our customary governance systems that will help to manage and govern our lands in a respectful way, then certainly they can have our votes and we can build our nation states together.
Let me just say, I agree with you in that. I think this is also how change can occur in the United States, but also at the University of Pennsylvania. It is about how to individually begin to push and insist upon change rather than simply living within the structure that exists today. So I think both of your points are very, very important and powerful in terms of this. Would you like to?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I mean, 3 words: economy, science. One size does not fit all. That in a sense, our relationship with the land and the way that we think about land and resources is informed by science. Okay, so that's related to the university. If you look at Decolonial science, like the origins of science, that shapes the way that we think about land and resources. 2, the economy. Okay, I mean, where does our concept of land as resources, as private property comes from? Obviously, it's the economy. And the third thing is, like, we tend to assume that one size fits all. But is it possible to have, for example, within Belize, a more plural society in which, you know, yeah, Maya people down in Toledo can have a common form of land ownership, and they can build an economy based on reciprocity. But you know what? In another part, it might be different. I don't know. Those might be things that might need to change.
Thank you. And we'd like a question.
Hi, thank you very much for an illuminating and inspiring conversation. I wanted to ask if you could speak a little bit to the question of the potential and perhaps the challenges involved for your movement with connecting to others in Guatemala or in other parts of the Americas, and what might we learn from your experience there?
Thank you very much. You know, one of the things I always say is I think Toledo as a case study has some unique opportunities that perhaps you don't find in many other indigenous communities immediately around us within Central America. For instance, we were left for many decades and not necessarily felt the pressure of immediately the British. So there was an opportunity for us to continue sustaining our communities and in particular our system of governance. And so system of governance and relationship to the land, to the immediate land communities. And that has allowed us to then continue that practice now. So my colleague here, Mr. Richard, for instance, knows that if you go to a Maya community, you just don't show up. There's a process to go through. Even if I would like to go to the neighboring community to do something, I'd have to go through that process as well. And so those are some unique, I think, opportunities that we've been able to retain us as the Maya people. And mind you, as we speak right now, that system of governance continues to evolve as well, because it must stay relevant. It must stay, it must be responding to the changing needs of the community. And this is, again, very important to understand, because we're not idealizing indigenous people's ways here. We were talking about a living people who are trying to survive within these contentious spaces that we're talking about. So there's change that's happening, but there's something very important. One, it is rooted in a way of thinking, a way of understanding oneself and the world around them. So there are values and principles that won't change. How you go about navigating the day-to-day may change. So that's something that's very unique, I think, for us as Maya communities. Now, immediately around us, for instance, the Mayas in Mexico, in Guatemala, we've enjoyed some solidarity and some collaboration, but we've not done enough. And I say that because the realities are also different. Guatemala went through a very terrible civil war. Mexico similarly has been through that same process. And us, as I was saying in Toledo, kind of have not necessarily went through the same process on the lands that we're on, but all of that, and then add the imposition of borders, language barrier. Here we are speaking English, and we always say us, the Maya, Ekchi, and Mopan. We never really feel that we fit in Central America because everything else is Spanish around us. And I don't think Central America necessarily, they don't think of us first when issues of indigenous issues come up. And then when you think of the Caribbean as well, because we're also part of the Caribbean, again, the realities there are so different. And so we actively try to build alliances. We've increased our collaboration with Mayas in Guatemala. And just in the past few weeks, we've been, there was a meeting held again to try to organize indigenous peoples representation in the Caribbean, because ultimately our issues are the same. Our realities might be different, but we do believe that there is strength in collective knowledge and collective energy.
Certainly, just two things on that question. First of all, it's important to collaborate with other indigenous peoples, not just regionally, but globally, because it helps us, it reminds us that we're not in struggle alone, that we're in struggle together, that there's a lot of people around the world struggling for some of the same fundamental rights, fundamental issues that threaten their survival. And so that's important for us to recognize that we're not alone. Two, the experiences. We might not be able to replicate the same things, the same strategies that were used in Belize, or the same paths that we walked in other different contexts. But what we can do is learn from the experience, and what we can do is borrow from the experiences that we have been able to provide in the Belize case, in the Belize context. For instance, we are Belize, the domestic courts of Belize was the first to recognize and affirm indigenous peoples' rights in that region, in that part of the world. And even as we speak about it now, our case is often used in other litigation where indigenous peoples are also trying to have their rights to their lands affirmed. And so that has become an important and precedent-setting case for many indigenous peoples in that region and in the world. But that experience alone is what we can offer. It might not work for everybody, but it certainly is an experience that you could learn from.
Thank you very much. Actually, let me just add just a very quick comment about the Community Museum Project, because in fact, we're hoping to have a community museum project both in Mexico with Maya people related to the Maya social war from the 19th century, but also in Belize. And so our hope is in fact to connect people from Mexico and Belize as we begin to sort of move forward with a museum project, and also be going to Oaxaca with this very strong museum program, many indigenous museums, and then also come here to Philadelphia for a conversation. And maybe we can come back here to Perry World House, as well as in fact going to New Mexico and working with some of the indigenous people there who are focused on the preservation of heritage and the figuring out how to profit from that heritage while at the same time preserving it and saving it for generations. So this is a very large project that all three of these people are very well aware of, and that we're trying to work together to move this process forward. There was one more question here, which was, what are the barriers to international collaboration and participation for Indigenous people? And actually, let me just, if I could add to that question, are you optimistic about the future as we move into the 21st century? Are we optimistic about Indigenous rights and thinking about not just what are the barriers, but also how do we begin to move these issues forward on an international scale? Filiberto, do you want to start maybe, or do you want to?
Sure. I want to borrow an idea from Enrique Dussel, I think is an Latin American philosopher. And he says, I have great hopes, but I expect very little. Right? So I think we of course we're optimistic. I mean, of course we could never give up on hope, right? I mean, where would we be without that? But unfortunately, things move very slow. That's kind of certainly what I see. In terms of indigenous rights, I think it's a great advancement. It's not perfect, okay, but we are talking now about collective rights, which we weren't talking about, in the past. So definitely, I think that's something important. I think kind of along those lines, one of the thoughts I had was that, while human rights and indigenous rights are all important, they tend to focus more on the idea of safeguarding. We're going to safeguard, we're going to protect indigenous peoples. And you have to say, well, protect them from what? Which raises all kinds of questions. So I think it'd be great if we could move towards a space where we're seeing indigenous peoples not so much as people that need to be protected, so to speak, right? But actually major contributors in building a future that, I mean, doesn't look very good, right? When you think about climate change. So I would love to see how we can shift that to seeing as indigenous peoples as agents, acting, of course, in constrained spaces, who have much to contribute to resolving the challenges that we face as humanity.
And maybe just quickly on that, again, as I said, I've had the opportunity to be with colleagues in the global discussion on indigenous rights. And there's sometimes this feeling that, okay, I'm going to go to the United Nations session and we will come home with answers. That's not the reality of these things, as Filiberto mentioned. But there is hope. And I think that what's happening in terms of our conversation at the international level on human rights, indigenous people's rights, are important pressure points that we must occupy. But keep in mind, as we're reminded by one of our leaders, it says, our rights are not going to be won in New York or Geneva. It says, it's going to be won at home. So we also cannot ignore what's happening on the ground. We need to invest equal. And this is why the community museum is, for instance, an important partnership. We need to build partnership with indigenous people's efforts in their communities on the ground, where they're actually not just talking about these ideas, they're actually responding in practical terms to their realities. So for students, for professors, for professionals, I think that there is an opportunity to partner with indigenous communities to do great work at the community level, while the discussion at the global level will continue, but at the community level is what's crucial in our experience.
I think we have time for one more last question.
Okay, my question is about the generation difference. According to your observation, in terms of the relationship with the lands, have this relationship changed for the younger generation Maya people? If there is any, what are the changes? Thank you.
But there's certainly a lot of changes and a lot of erosion of practice of, for instance, language alone, right? Loss of language, loss of expression. My two children are here with me, for instance, and it's very difficult when they spend a tremendous amount of their time in school learning English and learning the sciences and not enough time with their relatives and their extended community learning the things that we would like to have transmitted. And so there's certainly some generational changes. There's also the mass media, impressions on young people where they're challenged even with their own identity, right? Mainstream society looks more attractive and certainly something that they want to be a part of. And so they themselves begin to second guess their own identity as Indigenous peoples. And so we have a lot of work ahead of us. At the same time, we continue to remain on the land, and that has been an integral part of sustaining an identity, sustaining a way of life, a way of knowing, a way of being. I like to use and repeat a concept that Filiberto, in fact, has spoken about many, many times. You have to be rooted and really root yourself in your language, in your practices, in your value system, in the cosmovision of Maya people, in order for you to reroute yourself. So it's not, the idea is not to remain static or to have culture, think about it as a static thing, right? This is the criteria for being Kekchi, or this is the criteria for being Mopan, but rather to be able to be grounded and rooted in order then to discover new paths. You can be Ekchi anywhere in the world. You can be Ekchi as anything you want to be in the world, but remembering and recalling your grounding, your rooting is really critical for our young people to continue to survive as Maya people in contemporary times. And maybe just to the last question that you asked, I think that a lot of times when you're in the trenches, when you're working on the day-to-day challenges of Indigenous people and you're putting out fires every day, you tend to become cynical about the world. You tend to lose hope in some sense, and you tend to see it as really a dire situation. But it's always good to reflect on the advances that we have made, however minute that might be. For instance, the government, for example, now is talking openly about Indigenous people's rights, right? They are now no longer coming to say, well, do you want communal lands or do you want private property? Those questions are now null and void because the narrative has changed. We've shifted that attitude to now saying, well, now an oil company is coming. I need to go to the communities and at the very minimum follow a process of free, prior, and informed consent. So we've seen advances, but it's hard to see that when you're sort of in the middle, you're always in contested spaces. You're always operating within spaces that are contentious. And so it's always a place where we have to stop and reflect and know that, yes, indeed, there is hope. It might be slow, but there's always hope.
Before I turn it over to LaShawn, let me just say, I think the opportunity for Penn, for you people, for all three of you to be speaking here, but more importantly, even to come to classes with students is so wonderful. And I think that the students will have a better sense and understanding of what many of these issues are that I don't think they understand now without your being able to come there and talk to them directly. So thank you for your time and thank you for your energy and your interest.
And this is where I pop back up on stage and where someone in the back waves me to be more on camera, but I do not like giving our guests my back, which is why I'm always kind of plastered here on the corner. So I wanted to give you all a warm round of applause for your insights. We may never let you go home again, but I think that kind of some of the takeaways of this session are And increasingly, I feel like when we're in the World Forum having these discussions, that we have to allow ourselves to reimagine the world in which we live. Like that all of this really requires us to think differently. And oftentimes when we think of land as a resource, thus begins the first problem, that we think of land as a resource. And we don't ask ourselves, what do we owe the land actually? We ask, what does the land owe us and how can we use it, rather than how are we a part of it and what do we owe it? And stewardship in the broadest and most expansive sense of the world. The reason that I was left optimistic by the panel, and I was really happy for that final note, is because I feel like Belize offers us a little bit of a roadmap of what's possible. We oftentimes know in social justice work that change is incremental. And for a lot of us, that makes us very impatient and unhappy. But if it's sustained and if it's genuinely kind of held and honored, I feel like that's okay. But most important, that Belize is a model of that, a model of what's been achieved at the national level, and that I feel like is an example for other places, not just in Central America, but all around the world. So thank you for your stewardship in the broadest sense of the world and your leadership in terms of what's possible for the rest of the world. But it does require something on our parts, and it's reimagining how we are in the world. And that's a hard thing to do. So with that, again, I want to thank you all for joining us today. Thank you all, of course, and just want to say a couple of words to end. Next week in this space, we will not have a World Today. We will have a series of conversations about different career opportunities in the global sphere. It's a part of our annual Global Career Week here at Penn and at Perry Worldhouse. And those events are in person only and primarily for students. But on Monday, we'll be talking about, that's the 17th, Careers in Human Rights and International Development. On Tuesday, which is the 18th, we'll be featuring a panel on careers in national security and foreign policy. On Thursday, the 20th, there'll be a panel talking about internships and fellowship research. And on Friday, you'll be able to come and learn about Penn Global's research and internship program. So we're really excited to offer that to students who are in the audience. So bring a friend, spread the word, go online and get additional information. As always, you can find our recordings of our various programs on YouTube, and you can follow us on social media, including Twitter and Facebook. We have grab and go snacks in the back for those of you who are in the audience, and for those of you online, sorry, and we'll see you here next time. Thank you.